What happens when one of Britain's most beloved actors sits down for what should be a simple morning chat and finds himself under attack by a host who seems determined to tear him apart on live television? In just 37 seconds, a friendly interview turned into one of the most shocking confrontations in daytime TV history, and it all ended with Hugh Grant walking off set, leaving Lorraine Kelly speechless. The morning started like any other on the Lorraine Kelly show. The cameras were rolling, the studio audience was settled in their seats, and Hugh Grant walked onto the brightly lit stage with that characteristic smile everyone knew so well. He was there to talk about his latest film project, a role he was genuinely excited about. The applause was warm as he took his seat on the famous purple sofa, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. Lorraine Kelly sat across from him, flanked by her regular panelists. To her left was entertainment correspondent Sarah Matthews, a woman known for her sharp commentary and quick wit. To her right sat television critic David Chen, who had been a fixture on the show for years. Both of them smiled politely as Hugh settled into his seat, adjusting his jacket and preparing for what he assumed would be a pleasant conversation. But from the very first question, something felt off. "So Hugh," Lorraine began, leaning forward with an expression that seemed just a bit too eager, "let's talk about your new film. Though I have to say, some people are wondering if you're even still relevant in today's cinema landscape." The studio went quiet. Sarah Matthews shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Even the camera operators seemed to pause for a moment. Hugh's smile faltered, just slightly, but he recovered quickly, choosing to take the high road. "Well, that's certainly one way to start an interview," he said with a light laugh. "I think the film speaks for itself. We've got a wonderful cast and a story that I believe audiences will really connect with." Lorraine wasn't satisfied with that answer. She pressed forward, her tone becoming sharper. "But you have to admit, Hugh, your last few projects haven't exactly set the box office on fire. Some critics have said you're just playing the same character over and over again. Do you ever worry that people are tired of seeing the same Hugh Grant in every role?" David Chen glanced at Sarah, his eyebrows raised. This was unusually aggressive, even for a host known for asking tough questions. Hugh straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening just a fraction. "I think that's a bit unfair," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Every actor brings elements of themselves to their roles. That's what makes performances authentic. I've worked very hard on this character, and he's quite different from anything I've done before." "Is he, though?" Lorraine interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "Because from what I've seen in the trailers, it looks like the same charming, bumbling routine we've seen from you for decades. At what point do you think audiences deserve something new?" The audience was silent now, the tension palpable. Sarah Matthews leaned forward, trying to interject. "I think what's interesting about Hugh's career," she started, clearly attempting to redirect the conversation, "is how he's managed to—" "Sarah, I'm speaking with our guest," Lorraine cut her off sharply, not even looking in her direction. "Hugh, I'm just asking the questions that everyone at home is thinking. Surely you can handle a bit of honest criticism?" Hugh took a deep breath. His hands, which had been resting casually on his knees, were now clasped together, but he maintained his composure. "There's a difference between honest criticism and being deliberately provocative, Lorraine. I came here to talk about a film that I'm proud of, not to be ambushed." "Ambushed?" Lorraine laughed, a sound that came across as condescending rather than amused. "Oh, please, Hugh. You're a big star. You can't expect everyone to just fawn over you all the time. Maybe you've gotten too used to people treating you with kid gloves." David Chen cleared his throat, attempting to ease the tension. "Perhaps we could discuss the director's vision for the film," he suggested diplomatically. "I understand you worked quite closely with—" "David, honestly," Lorraine snapped, turning to glare at him. "Can we please stay on topic? I'm trying to have a real conversation here, not some fluff piece." She turned back to Hugh, her expression hardening. You know what I think, Hugh? I think you've surrounded yourself with yes men for so long that you can't handle it when someone actually tells you the truth. Your recent films have been mediocre at best, and rather than acknowledging that and showing some growth, you're sitting here acting offended because I'm not kissing your feet. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted completely. What started as an uncomfortable interview had evolved into something much uglier. Hugh's face was flushed now, and his polite smile had disappeared entirely. "That's completely out of line," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "You don't know anything about my working relationships or my creative process. You're making assumptions based on absolutely nothing." "Am I?" Lorraine shot back. "Because I've been in this industry for a very long time, Hugh. I've interviewed hundreds of actors, and I can spot someone who's lost their edge from a mile away. You're coasting on your old reputation, and frankly, it's getting embarrassing to watch." Sarah Matthews looked horrified. She opened her mouth to speak, but seemed unable to find the words. The audience members were glancing at each other, unsure if they should react or stay silent. Hugh leaned forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Lorraine, I don't know what's going on with you today, but this isn't journalism. This is just mean-spirited. I've done nothing to deserve this level of hostility." "Oh, here we go," Lorraine said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "The victim card. How predictable. Can't take the heat, Hugh. Maybe that's why your career is where it is right now." David Chen tried once more to intervene. "Lorraine, I really think we should move on to—" "David, for the last time, stay out of this," Lorraine snapped, her voice rising. "This is my show, and I'll run it how I see fit. If Hugh here can't handle a few tough questions, maybe he shouldn't be doing press tours at all." That was the breaking point. Hugh stood up abruptly, removing the small microphone that had been clipped to his jacket. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard. "Tough questions?" Hugh repeated, his voice raised for the first time. "Is that what you think this is? You've done nothing but insult me since I sat down. You've dismissed my work, attacked my character, and talked down to your own colleagues. This isn't an interview, Lorraine. This is you trying to humiliate someone for your own entertainment." Lorraine stood as well, her face reddening. "How dare you?" she said, pointing a finger at him. "I've been nothing but professional. You're the one who can't handle honest feedback. Maybe if you spent less time being precious about your image and more time actually improving your craft, we wouldn't be having this conversation." "Professional?" Hugh laughed bitterly. "You ambushed me. You belittled me. And you treated your own panelists like they were children for trying to do their jobs. There's nothing professional about any of this." Sarah Matthews finally found her voice. "Hugh's right," she said quietly but firmly. "This has gone way too far, Lorraine." Lorraine whipped around to face her. "Excuse me? Sarah, you work for me. Remember that." "I work for the show," Sarah corrected, her voice stronger now. "And what you're doing right now is wrong. Hugh came here in good faith, and you've attacked him from the moment he sat down." David Chen nodded in agreement. "She's right, Lorraine. I've been on this panel for years, and I've never seen you treat a guest like this. It's uncalled for." Lorraine's face was now bright red, her composure completely shattered. "I cannot believe this," she sputtered. "You're all turning on me? On my own show?" "You turned on yourself," Hugh said, his voice calm now, but filled with disappointment. "You had a chance to have a perfectly nice conversation about a film that a lot of people worked very hard on. Instead, you chose to make it about tearing me down. I don't know what I did to make you dislike me so much, but I'm not going to stand here and take it anymore." He handed the microphone to a nearby crew member and started walking toward the exit. Lorraine called after him. "If you walk off this set, Hugh Grant, you'll never be invited back on this show again." Hugh paused at the edge of the stage and turned back to look at her. "Lorraine," he said simply, "that's not the threat you think it is." And with that, he walked off. The studio erupted in whispers. Some audience members were applauding. Others looked shocked. Sarah Matthews was shaking her head, while David Chin sat with his arms crossed, looking deeply uncomfortable. Lorraine stood there, frozen, clearly not expecting her guest to actually leave. For several long seconds, she seemed unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, it came out weak and uncertain. "Well," she said, attempting to regain control, "I suppose that's that. We'll take a quick break." But the damage was done. Sarah Matthews removed her own microphone and stood up. "I think I'm done for today as well," she said, her voice steady. "What just happened was unprofessional and cruel, and I can't be a part of it." David Chen hesitated for just a moment, before following suit. "I agree," he said simply. "This isn't what I signed up for." Both of them walked off the set, leaving Lorraine standing alone. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of her stunned silence. The audience didn't know where to look. Some were still whispering to each other. Others were checking their phones, likely already spreading word of what they had just witnessed. Lorraine looked around at the empty chairs, at the departing backs of her colleagues, at the audience staring at her with a mixture of confusion and judgment. Her mouth opened and closed several times, as if she wanted to say something, anything, that could salvage the situation. But no words came. A producer rushed onto the set, speaking urgently into her earpiece. She nodded mechanically, her face pale. Finally, she turned to the cameras with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Right," she said, her voice hollow. "We're going to take that break now. We'll be back shortly with our cooking segment." But everyone watching knew that wasn't true. The show was over, not just for the day, but in a much bigger sense. What should have been a routine celebrity interview had turned into a public disaster, and it was all because Lorraine Kelly had decided to attack rather than converse, to tear down rather than build up. As the studio lights dimmed and the crew began their emergency brake procedures, one thing was abundantly clear to everyone in that room, and to everyone who would eventually see the footage. Hugh Grant had come to promote his film with grace and professionalism. He had endured insult after insult, maintaining his composure far longer than most people would have. And when he finally decided he had had enough, he left with his dignity intact. The same could not be said for Lorraine Kelly. What had she been thinking? That's what everyone was asking as they filtered out of the studio or watched from their homes. Why had she been so aggressive, so hostile, so determined to provoke a confrontation? These were questions that would be asked again and again in the hours and days that followed. But in that moment, all that mattered was what had just happened. A respected actor had been disrespected on live television. A host had forgotten that her job was to facilitate conversation, not to create conflict for its own sake. And an entire panel had witnessed their colleague's spectacular loss of professional judgment. The audience members who had come expecting a light, entertaining morning show left with a story they would tell for years. The crew members who had worked countless episodes without incident now had to figure out how to proceed. And Hugh Grant, walking out of the studio and into the fresh morning air, could finally breathe easy, knowing he had stood up for himself when it mattered most. Inside his dressing room, Hugh sat down and let out a long exhale. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation still coursing through him. A production assistant knocked softly on the door. "Mr. Grant, are you all right? Can we get you anything?" He looked up and managed a genuine smile, the first real smile he had managed since sitting on that purple sofa. "I'm fine," he said. "Actually, I'm better than fine. Thank you for asking." Because despite the ugliness of what had just occurred, despite the shock and the anger and the disbelief, Hugh Grant knew he had done the right thing. He had given Lorraine Kelly every opportunity to course correct, to ease up, to remember that there was a human being sitting across from her. He had remained polite even when she was rude, calm even when she was aggressive, dignified even when she tried to strip him of his dignity. And when it became clear that she had no intention of changing her approach, when her own colleagues began to see the problem and speak up, he had made the only choice that respected himself and his work. He had walked away. Back on the set, Lorraine sat in her dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup was still perfect, her hair still styled just so. But something in her eyes had changed. The confidence that usually radiated from her had dimmed, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Her phone was already buzzing with messages. Her producer had tried to come in twice, but she had waved them away. She needed a moment to process what had just happened, to understand how a simple interview had spiraled so completely out of control. But deep down, she knew exactly how it had happened. She had let her ego take over. She had decided that being provocative was more important than being fair. She had treated a guest with contempt and her colleagues with dismissiveness. And now she was sitting alone in her dressing room, facing the consequences of those choices. Meanwhile, Sarah Matthews and David Chen had found each other in the hallway outside their dressing rooms. They stood together in silence for a moment before Sarah spoke. "I can't believe that just happened," she said softly. David nodded, his expression serious. "I've never walked off set before, never even considered it. But what else could we do? She was completely out of line." "Did you see Hugh's face?" Sarah asked. He tried so hard to keep it together. He was so patient with her, even when she was being awful. "He handled it better than I would have," David admitted. "I wanted to step in earlier, but I kept thinking maybe she would stop. Maybe she would realize what she was doing." "She never did, though," Sarah said. "She just kept pushing and pushing until he had no choice but to leave." They stood in silence again, both processing the bizarre turn their workday had taken. Neither of them knew what would happen next, whether they would still have jobs, whether Lorraine would face any real consequences for her behavior. But they both knew they had done the right thing by speaking up, just as Hugh had done the right thing by walking away. In the studio audience waiting area, people were gathering their coats and bags, still buzzing with shocked energy. A young woman turned to her friend. "Did that really just happen? Did we just watch Hugh Grant get kicked off a talk show?" Her friend shook her head. "He wasn't kicked off. He left. There's a big difference. Did you hear what she was saying to him? It was horrible." "I know," the first woman agreed. "I felt so bad for him. He seemed like such a nice guy, and she just went after him for no reason." An older gentleman nearby overheard them and nodded. "I've been watching Lorraine Kelly for years," he said. "I've never seen her act like that. Something was very wrong today." And that was the sentiment echoing through everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Something had been very wrong. The usual warmth and friendliness that characterized daytime. Television had been replaced by hostility and aggression. A guest who came in good faith had been treated poorly, and the consequences of that treatment had played out in real time for everyone to see. The makeup artist who had prepared Hugh for his appearance was talking to a cameraman in hushed tones. "He was so lovely when I was working with him," she said. "Polite, friendly, asked me about my day. And then to see her treat him like that." The cameraman nodded grimly. "I've filmed some awkward interviews before, but that was something else entirely. The worst part is, we all saw it coming. From the first question, you could feel it going wrong." Back in his dressing room, Hugh was preparing to leave the building. He gathered his things, checked his phone, and took one last look around. As he opened the door to leave, he nearly bumped into Sarah Matthews. "Hugh," she said, slightly breathless. "I wanted to catch you before you left. I am so sorry about what happened out there." Hugh's expression softened. "Sarah, you have nothing to apologize for. You tried to help. You and David both did. I appreciate that more than you know." "What she did was inexcusable," Sarah continued. "I've worked with her for 3 years, and I've never seen her like that. I don't know what got into her. Neither do I, Hugh said honestly. But it doesn't matter now. What matters is that you spoke up when it counted. That took courage. Sarah smiled sadly. Not as much courage as it took for you to walk away. I know how hard that must have been. Hugh considered this for a moment. It was hard, he admitted. But staying would have been harder. Sometimes you have to draw a line and say, this is not acceptable. This is not how people should treat each other. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. For what it's worth, I think you handled it with incredible grace. They shook hands, and Hugh made his way to the exit. As he walked through the corridors of the studio, past crew members who nodded sympathetically and avoided eye contact out of respect for what he had just endured, he felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. He had come to talk about his work, about a project he believed in. He had been ready to share stories from the set, to laugh about funny moments during filming, to give the audience a glimpse into the creative process. Instead, he had been forced into a position where he had to defend not just his work, but his basic dignity as a person. And he had done it. He had stood his ground without losing his temper, without stooping to Lorraine's level, without becoming the villain in a situation where he was clearly the victim. He had given her multiple chances to change course, had remained respectful even when she was not, and had only left when it became absolutely clear that nothing was going to improve. As he stepped out into the morning sunlight, Hugh took a deep breath of fresh air. His car was waiting, and in a few minutes, he would be away from this building, this studio, this entire bizarre experience. But the memory of what had happened would stay with him, not as a source of bitterness, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own mistreatment. The driver opened the door for him, and Hugh slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, he looked back at the building one last time. Somewhere in there, Lorraine Kelly was probably trying to figure out how to spin what had just happened, how to explain her behavior, how to minimize the damage to her reputation and her show. But that was her problem now, not his. Hugh had done everything he could to make the interview work. He had been professional, patient, and more forgiving than most people would have been in his position. The failure of the interview wasn't his responsibility to fix. He pulled out his phone and saw several missed calls and text messages, his publicist, his agent, friends who had somehow already heard what happened. He would deal with all of that soon, but for now, he just wanted a moment of quiet to process everything. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had come to promote a film, to share his passion for a project, to connect with an audience. Instead, he had become part of a completely different story, one about standing up for yourself, about knowing when to walk away, about maintaining your dignity in the face of unwarranted hostility. It wasn't the story he had wanted to tell, but it was an important one nonetheless. And as the car navigated through the morning traffic, Hugh Grant allowed himself a small smile, knowing that whatever else happened, he had handled himself with integrity and courage.